There we go. Right, welcome back. This is our second in the iteration of our attempts to look at the sages of the early rabbinic period. I think most of you were with us last time when we looked at probably the first rabbi, arguably, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who got himself out of the siege of Jerusalem and founded the rabbinic establishment as we know it in the town of Yavneh in about the year 70. We're going to move on slowly to the next generation. Originally, I was going to skip a whole generation and go to Rabbi Akiva, who's 2 generations on, but actually decided that I wanted to look at the in-between because it's actually really important to understand who Yohanan's students are and how that develops this tradition of rabbinic Judaism that he really started. So we're going to look at 2 people today. And it's very typical for the rabbis that they worked in pairs. The very first pair in the kind of pre-rabbinic period was famously Hillel and Shammai, 2 teachers, neither of whom is given the title rabbi, but 2 of the first teachers of the movement of the Prushim, whose teachings were quite different in many ways, and who created 2 different schools of thought. That tension between those 2 schools of thought continued for many, many years, part of which we'll see in looking at today's 2 characters. And it was the case that many times the leadership of the Jewish community was exemplified not by one person, as it was with Yochanan, but by 2. Sometimes those were friends, sometimes enemies, sometimes one was more of a spiritual leader, sometimes more of a political leader. But the 2 of his students who were the most significant and who shaped Judaism in the generation following Yochanan ben Zakkai were 2 men, one named Rabbi Eliezer and the other named Rabbi Yehoshua. Both are quite different and both give us an interesting window into how Judaism could have developed and what the debates were in the very, very earliest years of the rabbinic movement. So I want to look a little bit at who these 2 men were, what their origin stories were, what their personalities were like, and then we're going to zoom in on a very famous story that describes the debate that took place between them and the aftermath as a result. So I'm going to share my screen, and as we've done last time, if possible, it would be really good if we can take turns reading so you don't have to listen to me the whole time. Nobody wants that. Hopefully you can see the screen in front of you, and you can see I've tried as much as possible to date where we are, although it's very hard because none of these people were too interested in accurate dates. But both of these men, Eliezer and Yehoshua, were young men when the temple was destroyed. They were the ones who helped Rabbi Yochanan get out of the siege of Jerusalem. They were the 2 who helped him fake his death, go in a coffin, and meet the Emperor Vespasian. And after he moves to Yavneh, he takes them with him, and they become his 2 primary students. Originally, there were 5, but the other 3 drift off for various reasons, which we're not going to dwell on now. And these 2, Eliezer and Yehoshua, become the predominant teachers of Judaism in the next generation. So I'll just read this first text, which gives us some context, which is, oh, lovely, Jason Yvonne, thank you for tuning in. So this gives us some context into who Rabbi Yochanan's students were. And obviously, we're very focused on the idea of an academy and a chain of tradition. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples, and they were Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Ḥananiah, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. He used to recount their merits. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, a plastered well that never loses a drop. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Ḥananiah, happy is she who gave birth to him. Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, a pious person. Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, a person who fears mistakes. And Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, an ever-flowing spring. So we have this layout of these 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan. This is from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. And you can see that he gives a brief description of these individuals, which is partially helpful to us understanding who they are. The 2 that are an obvious contrast from this, if anyone noticed, are the first, one of the ones we're going to deal with, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who's described as a plastered well that never loses a drop. If you imagine the idea of a well of water that's plastered so that nothing can escape, what Rabbi Yoḥanan meant was that everything that he learned, he retained. He had a very good memory. He retained everything. He was kind of contained and restrained in his teaching of Torah. And his foil, as a result, is the last one here, Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach, who is the opposite of a well. He's a spring, an ever-flowing spring. For a variety of reasons, Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach, the last one, goes off the derech, we would say today. He disappears from the scene. He moves house and kind of disappears, and there's a variety of stories as to why. And so the other person that becomes predominant is Rabbi Yehoshua, who we're going to look at today. So it's these two in the first instance, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, who are the two characters that we're going to meet and try and get a sense of. We're going to do it in turn. So first, we're going to take a look at who Rabbi Eliezer was. We can just call him Eliezer for the ease of referring to him. But already you get a hint as to who he was based on his father's name, Hyrcanus. You can probably guess is a Greek name. So someone want to read this first story for us? This is the beginning of Rabbi Eliezer's story as a student of Rabbi Yoḥanan. Anybody fancy reading for us? Hi, David. David, I'm going to nominate you.
It's on my phone. It's too small.
All right. Anybody fancy reading? Janice?
Yeah, you're on mute. I'll do it.
Oh, okay. Who was that? Shiloh. Shiloh, come back.
Okay. Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So how did Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus begin learning Torah? He was 22 years old and had never studied Torah. One time he said, I will go and study Torah with Rabbi Yoḥanan ben Zakkai. His father, Hyrcanus, and said to him, you will not taste a thing until you have ploughed the entire furrow. Eliezer got up early in the morning and ploughed the entire furrow. They say that it was a Friday. He went and dined with his father-in-law. Others say that he ate nothing from the 6 hours before Shabbat until the 6 hours after Shabbat. As he was walking on his way, he saw a stone. He picked it up and put it in his mouth, and some say that it was cattle dung. He went and spent the night in a hostel. Then he went and appeared before Rabbi Yoḥanan ben Zakkai in Jerusalem until a foul odor came forth from his mouth. Rabbi Yoḥanan ben Zakkai said to him, Eliezer, my son, have you eaten anything today? He remained silent. He asked him again and again. He remained silent. He sent word and inquired at the hostel. Has Eliezer eaten anything? They said to him. We thought that he might be eating with you, master, he said. Where did that go?
He said to them.
To them, and I thought he was eating with you. Between the two of us, we have nearly forsaken Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yoḥanan ben Zakkai said to Eliezer, just as a foul odor has come forth from your mouth, so too will your master of Torah come forth from your mouth.
Okay. Thank you, Charlotte. So what do we learn about Rabbi Eliezer and his background? Oh, pages, sorry. What do we learn about him? Did he grow up going to shul? No. No, I see some heads shaking, right? He's someone who grew up on an aristocratic land-owning family's estate, right? Fairly wealthy, we can infer. We can infer that from the name of his father, Hyrcanus, which is a Greek name, right? So he had taken a kind of Greek name and assimilated into society. And we can see that when he decides at the age of 22, then very much an adult, that he wants to go and learn Torah, seemingly randomly, his father immediately kind of bans him from it and says, no, you're not doing that until you've done all of your work. Right, until you've plowed the entire furrow, which may be a metaphor, may be a literal description of the labor he had to do for that day. Either way, the story tells us he did what he was supposed to, and then he ran away from home, basically. Okay, so he runs away. Either he goes to eat with his father-in-law, which doesn't make sense because we don't see him as being married at this stage, or the story continues, it was that he didn't eat anything. Right, because he had left his father's house. Presumably his father was not supporting him in this endeavor because he disagreed with him. And so he ran away from his house and he was starving, right? He didn't eat anything from the 6 hours before Shabbat until the 6 hours after Shabbat. That's a very long time to not eat anything, right? Longer than Yom Kippur, 30-something hours. He stayed at a hostel, obviously implying that he didn't have the funds to stay at a nicer place overnight. But he eventually got there to Jerusalem to meet with Rabbi Yochanan, and the overwhelming experience that Rabbi Yochanan had of meeting this young man who knew nothing about Torah and probably knew more Greek than Hebrew was that his mouth really stank, right? Perhaps because he was eating stones and rocks or maybe dung on his walk to Jerusalem to try and sate his hunger. Rabbi Yochanan asks the hostel, he phones the hostel, we can imagine, says, did he eat with you? And they say, no, we thought he ate with you. And Yochanan is panicked, going, oh no, we've forsaken him, right? We've messed up because each of us thought he was eating with the other one. In reality, he was fooling everyone and not telling them how destitute he was because he didn't potentially want to draw attention to himself. And as a result, he hadn't eaten anything for a very long time and was in a really bad state. But he wasn't telling them that. He remained silent whenever he was asked. So we get a picture of a young man who's very proud, very determined, who's come a long way to try and learn Torah, something which is new to him, and who is willing to forsake his father's house and everything that goes with that, including any financial support. Right? A very big and risky thing for someone to do. Quite an interesting portrayal. Yes, Shallow, sorry. Or whoever that was. Sorry, I can't see everyone. What do we think? Bold of Eliezer? Risky? Do we like this? Is a sympathetic character? Yeah, Nick is nodding. Right, we can't help but admire him some way. Someone who's striking out on his own, taking risks. There's something even kind of proud about the fact that he won't tell them that he's starving, right? It's like the kid who comes to school and hides the fact that he's very poor at home. There's something very strange about this encounter. But Yochanan immediately gets it wrong and then realizes that he's got it wrong and makes a commitment to Eliezer to say, just as your breath stinks now from foul odor, someday your breath will stink from all the Torah. Jana says it seems like he's very humble, which I think is accurate. Now there's a follow-on to the story regarding what happened later. So there's some time in the middle with Hyrcanus, right? His father, the wealthy land-owning estate owner. So I'll read this one. This is a lot of names. Hyrcanus, his father, heard that he was studying Torah with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So word gets around Eliezer ran away from home and is studying with Yochanan. He said, I will go and disinherit Eliezer from my property. They say that on that day, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sat expounding Torah in Jerusalem, and all the great men of Israel sat before him. He heard that Hyrcanus was coming. He set up guards and said to them, if he comes to take a seat among the students, do not let him come to take a seat. And they did not let him. He kept stepping over people and moving forward until he came to Ben Tzitzit HaKeset, Nakdimon ben Gurion, and Ben Kalba Savua. He sat among them trembling. It's just a bit of context. These three blokes who are named are the wealthiest people in Jerusalem in the generation. These are the bigwigs. What is happening is that Yochanan is basically hosting a fundraising dinner. Okay? And everyone respects Yochanan, the wealthy, the poor. He's very well respected as a spiritual leader of all of the Jewish people at this time. And Hyrcanus, who's one of these landed aristocratic gentry, decides he's going to come to the academy on that night in order to publicly shame his son for running away from home and for joining this band of Torah scholars, which he sees as clearly an unworthy pursuit. Yochanan hears this and evidently is quite protective over Eliezer. In some way, you have his kind of spiritual father versus his actual father, and tells all the guards to make sure that Hyrcanus can't sit anywhere. And so you have this amazing image of this fancy dinner. Everyone sat down, and Hyrcanus is being stopped by the guards, the bouncers at the door, and then he's kind of knocking over tables and chairs, and he quite rudely, and in a very kind of probably obvious way, finds his way sitting in the front row next to the most important people in Jerusalem, who always sat in the front row, right? Really high, important, valuable people. And he's kind of in a bad position, right? He's put himself, Rabbi Yochanan has made sure he would be put in a very uncomfortable position. They say on that day, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai looked at Rabbi Eliezer and said to him, cite a passage and give an exposition. The assumption is that during this fundraising dinner for the academy, Yochanan would ask his students who are learning Torah with him to show off the skills that they're learning so that he can ask for funds from the wealthy people who are there to say, look at all the great Torah we're teaching, right? This is the school gala dinner, basically, that happens once a year in order to raise money. And tonight, Yochanan chooses Eliezer to be the one to go up and teach, knowing that his father is in the audience. Eliezer said to him, I cannot. He urged him, and the other disciples urged him as well. And Eliezer stood up and delivered a discourse upon matters which no one had ever heard before. At every word he uttered, Rabbi Yochanan would stand up and kiss him on the head and say, Rabbi Eliezer, you have taught me the truth. Quite a big gesture. At the conclusion of the evening, Hyrcanus, his father, stood up and said, My lords, I came to disinherit my son Eliezer, but now all of my possessions will be given to Eliezer my son, and all his brothers will now have no share in them. And so the tables are turned quite dramatically. Why? Is it because Hyrcanus actually regrets the fact that he was wrong about the role that Torah plays? Or is it that he's so embarrassed, having put in this weird position, sitting in the front row with all the wealthy people of Jerusalem, and his son is the one on show, and everyone's going, oh yes, Eliezer is so smart, and the rabbi who leads the Jewish people, Yochanan, at every word he says is praising him and going, you're such a wise teacher. He has no choice but to actually go with the flow and say, yes, you're right, I'll give you all my property. Right, so there's a lovely kind of bizarre manipulative stitch up here on behalf of Rabbi Yochanan. We get this wily sense that he knows what's happening and is trying to help Eliezer by creating a situation where his father has no choice but to try and show respect to Rabbi Yochanan and the elders of Jerusalem by giving his son the funds that he's due. It's quite an amazing little window into what's going on here, right? And actually quite relatable in some way. If you imagine a similar scenario today, it wouldn't be so hard to imagine. Okay. One more on Eliezer's background, right? There's a statement in Avot elsewhere where Yochanan would say, quoted about him, if all the sages of Israel were in one scale of a balance, and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus in the other, he would outweigh them all. Right? So we get a picture of Yochanan ben Zakkai clearly feeling that Eliezer, this man who came to Torah at the age of 22, came late to it, was disowned by his father. They kind of convinced him to still provide some financial backing for him, but only really because he was blackmailed into it. Eliezer is clearly someone who he sees as a leading light of the next generation. Yeah? Okay. Now let's take a little bit of the background at our other individual, which is Rabbi Yehoshua. There's only two short statements about his own background, but they give us a quick sense of how different it was. So you'll remember in the statement, the first thing we read, Rabbi Yochanan said of Yehoshua, happy is she who gave birth to him. So Rashi, now much, much later, obviously, medieval Rashi, has a nice little comment about why he said this, which is that when his mother was pregnant with him, she used to pass by each of the Batei Midrash, those are the study houses, in her town and say to the sages, please pray that this child within me should become a wise sage. We have the exact opposite of Eliezer. With Yehoshua, we have his mother, even before he's born, around the synagogue, around the study hall, hoping that he's going to become a sage, encouraging and supporting him before he's even born. Another similar statement is recorded of a rabbi of the next generation, Dosa ben Hyrcanus, who used to say, when you see Rabbi Yehoshua recite the following words, to whom will he give instruction? From Isaiah. I remember that his mother used to bring his cradle to the synagogue, so that his ears would cleave to the words of Torah. Right, so another similar statement. So we have two men who are very different, right? Eliezer, someone who grew up wealthy, landed aristocracy outside Jerusalem, ran away from home to study Torah with Yochanan, disinherited by his father, is described as a plastered well that doesn't lose a drop, clearly someone who's controlled and very proud and very kind of dignified. And Yehoshua, who we don't have much of his personality yet, but we will, who was from the moment he was born and before, encouraged to be around the study house, to learn Torah, encouraged to embrace the way the rabbis thought, supported by his family and his parents, but on all accounts, someone who's very poor, right? And we know he's very poor because it describes only his mother. We don't know anything about his father. The implication is almost that she was a single mother, we read elsewhere about his childhood being quite poor. He basically was a ragamuffin who grew up in the Beit Midrash, was around the rabbis his entire life, never had much to go on, but was always fluent in Torah. And Eliezer was coming from a very different point of view. They meet as adults, as Yohanan's primary students, and they have very different approaches to how it is that Torah should be taught and how it is that Judaism should be promulgated in the generations to come. Any questions about that? So far, who do we like? Do we have opinions? Who do we like for best rabbi of the generation? Eliezer, Yehoshua, why? Anybody? Anybody? Team Eliezer? Team Yehoshua? I don't know. I'll ask you again later. You might change your view. Sarah, I can't hear you, but it looks like you're saying something.
We don't know enough about Yehoshua.
Well, fair. We don't know too much about him so far, but we'll see a bit more about him. So I suppose we should go on and see their personalities a bit more as adults. Fair, before we judge. So we're going to start with Rabbi Eliezer, taking a look at his personality and who he was. Anybody want to read still? Anybody feel like they're interested to read?
I can read.
Yes, David, do you want to read the first one here about Rabbi Eliezer?
In all my days, no one ever proceeded to me to the bed midrash, and I never slept in the bed midrash, neither a fixed sleep, nor even a nap, and I never left someone behind me in the bed midrash when I departed, and I never engaged in frivolous talk, and I never said a thing which I had not heard from my teachers. Right.
So this is a statement of Rabbi Eliezer. Again, this is very much adult Rabbi Eliezer reflecting back. He describes his own study as being assiduous, being meticulous, being early to the Beit Midrash and late to leave, never taking a nap, God forbid, in the Beit Midrash, unlike those other silly people who fall asleep while they're studying, never frivolous talk, right? And most importantly, the last thing's usually the most important in these lists, he never said anything which he didn't hear from his teachers. Right, so he wasn't a creative Torah teacher. He was someone who repeated what he learned, who remembered everything, remembered a plastered well that never loses a drop. As Shiloh says, very committed and focused. I think that's absolutely the picture we get. And also somewhat inflexible, we might say. We're going to see that more. But someone who's quite rigid with his expectations of himself. Maybe that makes sense. We can psychoanalyze. He came to it later in life. And so for him, it was very important to be rigid and determined and to catch up against someone like Yehoshua, who was always around and maybe a bit more casual about Torah. We can speculate. But we definitely have his own statement, his own words about his understanding of what his life was like. And he's someone who was very, very, very careful to always make sure he was at the Beit Midrash early and stayed late. A good thing, no doubt.
But we could say he was boasting.
You could say he was boasting. Yes, again, pride is something we can associate very closely with Eliezer, both the good and the bad, right? As a young man not telling him that he hadn't eaten anything, maybe not a great type of pride. Here he has a lot of pride in his own learning and background, and in the fact that he's not a creative Torah teacher, right? He's proud that he never said anything that he hadn't heard from his teachers. Okay. I don't want to subject anyone to read this next one, so I will. A Roman noblewoman asked Rabbi Eliezer, how is it that, though only one sin had been committed in the making of the golden calf, yet the Israelites died by 3 kinds of death? This is a reference to the fact that after the golden calf incident, the Israelites die in many different ways. Moses kills a bunch, the Levites kill a bunch of them drown, the whole thing, right? So this is a Roman noblewoman who has this question, presumably, obviously, a bit of a rude question about the Israelites, and poses it to Rabbi Eliezer. These two men were exposed to a lot of high-level Roman officials, as we'll see again and again in what we're looking at, and they have different responses to interacting with those Roman officials. Eliezer responds, women have no wisdom except for wielding the distaff. It's something you use in a loom, I believe, or a spinning thread. For scripture says, All the women that were wise-hearted did spin with their hands. That's from Exodus and describing the tabernacle. By the way, that's a positive thing about women that he's quoting, but he's using it in a negative way. Rabbi Eliezer's son, Hyrcanus, note he named his son after his father, said to his father, Rabbi Eliezer, because you would not give her an answer drawn from the teachings of Torah, you caused us the loss of 300 kor, not sure what that amount is, but it's a lot, of tithe that she used to give us every year. Rabbi Eliezer replied, let the 300 kor be burned rather than have the words of Torah entrusted to women. So, aside from the obvious misogyny in Rabbi Eliezer's approach, what else do we see here?
Again, we see
Commercial
part
thing
of the
again
sum.
going on, that the rabbis, are worried about the money coming into the kitty, if you think about it.
Okay, good. So his son, Eliezer's son, who he named Hyrcanus after his father who disowned him, is worried. He says, Dad, you just lost us a bunch of donations. You were rude to that lady and now she won't give us money anymore. Right, so you can see the real world implications that the rabbis and the academies were supported by Roman noblewomen, evidently. David, what were you going to say? No. Perhaps we can see here his pride as well, right? Pride being a theme of him. He doesn't like the question she asks, and so he evades it by making a nasty comment about women, but never actually answers her question. Right? The rigidity is showing, lol, says Shiloh. Right? He's unwilling to to answer her question, to engage with it, and he doesn't care that they lost all this money for the academy. His son is like, Dad, and he's like, I would rather see it burned than answer this woman's question. So we get a picture of someone who's quite inflexible, perhaps. Another lovely example of the same phenomenon. A story is told of a certain disciple who gave a decision in law, halacha, in the presence of his master, Rabbi Eliezer. Later, Rabbi Eliezer said to his wife, Ima Shalom, means mother of peace, by the way. Clearly they were opposites. Alas, for the wife of this man, he will not live out the week. He's talking about the student who spoke in front of him. The week was hardly over when that disciple died. As the sages came to offer their condolences, his other disciples asked him, Are you a prophet? He replied, I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, quoting again from Amos. But I have the following tradition. A disciple who gives a decision in law in the presence of his master is liable to the death penalty. So, what's happening here?
He's being very tough. And if it, why did the man die? The student died. Is it just a coincidence, or do you think?
Did he kill him?
Yeah.
I don't think we're meant to take away that he killed him, but there's certainly something very threatening about the fact that, he goes to the academy that day. One of his student, the one that he taught, decides to teach something in front of him, and those of us who are teachers would be excited about that. Oh, my student wants to kind of teach, you'd encourage that. But no, for him, this is a matter of respect. A student should never teach in front of their teacher, right? It was extremely rude and disrespectful. It breaks what is supposed to happen to do this. And so he comes home and tells his wife, oh, I'm so sad this guy's going to die. He's not even going to live out the week. And lo and behold, the guy dies, right? And his disciples think, that's pretty unusual. Is it just a coincidence? As you said, Janice, is it a coincidence? Are you a prophet? He says, I'm not a prophet, but this is something that I've learned. Again, he's always quoting other people's things. It's always something he learned from someone else. He says, I have a tradition that if a student teaches in front of their teacher, then they're going to die. So I just knew it.
That he himself taught in front of his teacher.
Very good, Sarah, right? He indeed taught in front of Yoḥanan ben Zakkai, his own teacher, at that academy gala dinner that we saw earlier when he was a young man. And do you remember what it said about him there? He taught something that had never been heard before in the academy. So what's changed? Clearly, as he's gotten older, he's become very rigid about his understanding, and he wouldn't even his younger self would not be acceptable to his older self, clearly, because now his older self never says anything that he didn't learn, always follows the rules, always gets to the Beit Midrash early, always makes sure that he's there teaching Torah. He's clearly an excellent teacher and clearly a very highly respected leader, but he's someone who's changed quite a bit from the young man that we met who first came to the academy of Rabbi Yoḥanan.
It sounds like he's sort of scared of someone stepping into his shoes and doing the same thing he did.
Perhaps.
As if like he had a student that was too good that outshine him or something.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a relatable insecurity if you're someone who prizes your knowledge and your knowledge is your identity. It is for him. He left his family behind to take knowledge his identity and Torah his identity. If his students start getting, the student has surpassed the master, maybe that's very threatening.
I think all the way through all the stories, and even at the beginning, when I said he was boasting, it's even more than that. I think he's very brash, if that's the right word. It's all I. Even when he left home, I'm going to do what I want to do. It's like, I'm not willing to listen to other people. I mean, despite the fact that he listens to the rabbis afterwards, it's, I'm the best. I'm the one who stays up. I'm the one who doesn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who knows this. I'm the one. It's all me, and I'm the best.
Yeah, you could definitely see that. He centers a lot of stuff on himself. It's unusual that we hear in these stories about, what a rabbi says to his wife when he gets home at the end of the day. Right, there's a real way in which his own views are the center, but yet what he says is always it's not about me, it's about what I learned. And that's the disconnect, right? He claims that everything's about, I learned this from someone else. It's not about me. I just pass on the tradition. But yet all the stories that we see him, he's often making it about him. Maybe we know people like this. Who's to say? Maybe you know someone like this.
He's arrogant and power has corrupted him.
Perhaps. There is a certain arrogance to it.
I was looking for. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
That's the word I was looking for.
I think Shiloh's insight is also very good, which comes from a place of insecurity, right? This is someone who came to it later in life, someone who maybe doesn't totally feel like he's one of the members, like he maybe doesn't feel like he's in the in-group. And so maybe doubles down on this sense of, no, I hold the tradition, I pass on the tradition, I am the tradition. Whereas as we'll see with Rabbi Yehoshua, he's very happy to be flexible and loose and silly and play around with stuff. He's not as bothered about the idea that the tradition might be compromised. And this is the question, is how do we relate to the tradition we have? Do we preserve it exactly intact and pass it on to the next generation? Do we play with it and be creative with it? They're two very different approaches to what we do with tradition, and it's still a argument that we're having today, literally every day, right? And it has been ongoing throughout Jewish history. So let's see the other side of the argument. Let's see Rabbi Yehoshua. Now, remember what we know about Yehoshua. Grew up in the Beit Midrash, grew up poor, raised by his mother, who always wanted him to become a Torah scholar. Never any internal drama about learning Torah, was always something natural to him, and was described by his teacher, Rabbi Yoḥanan, primarily in those terms, as happy as the woman who gave birth to him. Right? It's like, what a nice guy. Right? You get a sense that he's kind of likable and affable and at ease with the world of Torah, whereas Eliezer feels quite constrained and perhaps a bit kind of insecure, as we said. So, this is one of Yehoshua's teachings. Anyone want to read this for us? The bottom of the page here.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Yeah, is that Jason?
Yeah.
Go for it.
From the laws of Shabbat?
Yeah.
Okay. From the laws of Shabbat, festivals, and the illicit use of sacred objects are like mountains suspended by a thread. There is little biblical text on which these laws are based, yet the laws themselves are manifold. Regarding this, Rabbi Yehoshua spoke of tongues made with tongues. Who made the first tongue? It was created by itself.
Okay. A mystery. I like the mystery you added to it, Jason. Let's start with the mountain suspended by a thread, right? What a great image, right? Mountains suspended by a thread. This is in reference to the laws of Shabbat, the laws of festivals, and the laws of Truma, which are not so relevant to us because they're about the priesthood and the temple. But let's take the example of the laws of Shabbat. Right? The Torah says exactly two things about Shabbat, which are don't work and don't light a fire. And yet the rabbis obviously develop those laws into a whole body of literature. One of the largest sections of halakha is about the laws of Shabbat, including in agonizing detail about all sorts of things which are never mentioned in the Torah. That's the way the rabbis work, right? They're developing the legal system based on a few comments in the Torah and their own logic and some predetermined reasoning into a set of legal ideas. So it makes sense that, there's an acknowledgement here from Rabbi Yehoshua that these things are largely arbitrary, right? It's like a mountain suspended by a thread. It's based on the Torah, but most of it is actually something that we came up with. And then he gives us this bizarre image of tongs made with tongs, going back to the first tong. Right, so obviously tongs represent a tool that humans use. Pick up hot coals, something that was used in the temple. And the question is, in order to make tongs, which are metal, and you use in a blacksmithery to push them down into the hot water, how do you make tongs to use? You have to make them by doing the same thing, putting metal in a mold and putting the mold in using tongs. So it's this kind of chicken. This is the biblical equivalent or the Mishnaic equivalent of chicken and the egg. Right, which came first? The tongs that you're making or the tongs that you use in order to make the other tongs? If we can just assume it's the chicken and the egg as we talk about it debate, Rabbi Yehoshua's statement is, at some point, there's a moment of creativity. The first set of tongs had to be made by itself. It had to be invented. Because at some point, there had to be an original creative impulse that created the first thing in this chain of tradition. And this is his analogy for the chain of tradition. So Rabbi Eliezer thinks of the chain of tradition as something you pass on from one to the other. And Rabbi Yehoshua sees it as an original creative impulse that allowed us to be able to make mountains suspended by thread. Very different ideas. Right, do we see how different those are? One focused on creativity and innovation and being flexible and original, and the other focused on specifically not being original, on never saying anything you didn't hear from your teachers, on never speaking in front of your teachers, on repeating the tradition as you learned it. Yeah? Okay. So we get a couple good stories about Rabbi Yehoshua now as well. There's lots and lots of stories about both of these men. It was very hard to pick what to look at. Same idea with chickens being meat. Yes, and same idea in terms of how we read the Torah very widely. You could say that's a mountain suspended by thread because there's not much basis for a law like that. Okay, Rabbi Yehoshua said, if all the seas were ink and all reeds were pens, heaven and earth were all scrolls, and humankind were all scribes, they would not suffice to write down the Torah I learned, even though I abstracted from my master's teaching no more than a man would take when dipping the point of a paintbrush in a tube of paint. Amazing, multifaceted imagery here. Right, so what is he saying about his understanding of the tradition and how he taught and abstracted Torah?
That it's huge.
That is huge, right? It's indescribable. This language almost matches the language we use in the Siddur when we do Nishmat Kol Chai, right? If all of us ran as fast as deer and all of us could fly as fast as vultures, we still wouldn't be able to express our gratitude. Right? So here, he's using a scribal version of that. If all the seas were ink and all reeds were pens, no one could ever write down all the Torah I learned. So that's the first half of the statement, is I learned so much Torah that you can never write it down. It's just too much of it, right? Which, of course, by definition, is a contrast to a tradition which is written down and passed on. With something so big has to be more creative because you can't write it down. But he's saying, even though I abstracted quite a bit from what I learned, he's saying, even though I was original and I came up with new ideas and I innovated, I didn't do any more than you would do if you were dipping a paintbrush in a pot of paint. So if you imagine, if anyone's painted or decorated recently, or you take a pot of paint and you dip the paintbrush in and you use that paint to paint a wall, only a little bit of paint was taken out of the pot, but you can paint a whole wall as a result. That's the image he wants us to have in mind. So he didn't actually abstract that much, but with the little abstraction he did, with the little creative original thinking that he added to it, he managed to make so much new Torah that you could never possibly write it down. This is quite a different self-description than Eliezer saying, I was always at the Beit Midrash early, I was always the last one to leave, I never said anything my teachers didn't say. Literally opposites.
I mean, I think either I misunderstood or you've misunderstood. Because from what I understand you're saying is that the little that he did is still a huge amount. And I'm thinking, no, what he's saying is that if you're talking about a pot of paint, that the pot of paint is massive and he's just taken a little bit from it, which in itself is a lot, but it's just a little bit of this huge pot. He's not saying he was the originator of the huge pot in the first place.
No, that's right. That's right. You're correct. Right? He's suggesting that even though he only took a little bit of the paint from his teachers, even though he only innovated, was creative a little bit, with that little bit, he was able to create so much. He was able to paint so many things.
Is it a bit like the more you know, the more you realize, the less you know?
Maybe. There's certainly some kind of paradoxical language here of him saying, if all the seas were ink and all this stuff. And it's a bit of a mixed metaphor, his ink sea imagery and his paintbrush imagery. But I think the takeaway is he's saying, I did abstract things. I was creative, but I actually wasn't even that creative. I didn't even do it that much, only a little bit. I just dipped the paintbrush, right? And I only took a little bit. But with that, I was able to do so much.
I think we see it in any Beit Midrash, and I don't know about any other religion, but if you take the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and even add to it Tanakh, so even if you add the prophets and the Ketuvim, that's your starting point. But if you go into Beit Midrash and you see wall to wall to wall to wall to wall, from the ceiling to the ground, books expounding and describing, I mean, that is just, and that's what he's saying, is that it's just huge what we take from it. Yeah. And if you just add 2 more books, 3 more books, that is nothing compared to the thousands of books that already exist.
Right. Lovely. Absolutely lovely. And I think the very important point there, David, is that we are living in Rabbi Yehoshua's Judaism. And we will see why that is. But the Judaism that survives this generation very much follows this point of view, which is you can take and be creative and innovate and add to and develop. And it's a glorious thing. It's a good thing to kind of continue to expand and interpret more and more and more, not just to pass on what you heard from your teachers. A little more humble, Shiloh says. I'm not sure he's actually that much more humble, or if he's just bragging in a different way. They're still rabbis, after all. But let's see how he interacts with the Romans. We saw Rabbi Eliezer interacting with the Roman noblewoman. These are 2 lovely stories about how Rabbi Yehoshua interacted with the Emperor Hadrian. So, and both crack me up, right? The first one. Once the daughter of the Emperor Hadrian said to Rabbi Yehoshua, "What a pity, such glorious wisdom in such an ugly vessel." There's many references to how ugly Rabbi Yehoshua was and how beautiful Rabbi Eliezer was, by the way. So another contrast between them. He replied, "My daughter, in what kind of vessel does your father keep his wine?" She said, "Well, in a ceramic vessel." Rabbi Yehoshua said, "But ordinary people keep wine in ceramic vessels. Do you, too, the daughter of the emperor, keep your wine in such vessels?" She said, "What else would we keep it in?" Rabbi Yehoshua said, "You who are such important persons should keep it in vessels of silver and gold." So she went off and spoke to her father, the emperor, who immediately had the wine put into vessels of silver and gold, where it soon turned sour and spoiled. Then the emperor asked his daughter, "Who gave you such advice?" And she said, "Rabbi Yehoshua." The emperor had him summoned and asked him, "Why did you give my daughter such advice?" Rabbi Yehoshua said, "The same question she asked me, I turned around and asked her." The emperor said, "But are there not learned people who are also handsome?" Rabbi Yehoshua said, "If these handsome people were ugly, they'd be even more learned." Nick shaking his head. What's going on with this image of the question and the answer, David?
I think it is some humility, some I think it's it's gorgeous. I love it.
Why does he ask her about where she keeps her wine when she asks him, how can you be so ugly and be so wise?
Because the wine is makbil, is a mashal of the Torah, of study.
Mm-hmm.
And the Torah is often compared to wine, and therefore what she's saying, all this knowledge is in an ugly face like you, and he's saying, well, just like that, the wine, which you can compare to the Torah, or you can compare to something that's important to you, you can compare to a lot of things, you keep it in an ugly vessel. If you put it into a beautiful vessel, it goes off.
Yeah, really good. Right? And so he's both defending himself, he's the ugly one, and also kind of teaching in some way, and he's walking a very fine line here, kind of, getting sassy with the emperor. I mean, this is not something that you want to do if you don't want to get your head cut off generally, but he seems to get away with it. Right, the emperor is, I don't know, amused, annoyed, not clear, but he has an interesting reaction, which is to summon him and say, what did you tell my daughter? So yes, he defended himself, but also was mocking them a little bit as well, mocking the fact that they would listen and go, oh yes, we should put it in silver and gold, and then realize what a bad thing that was for their wine. Right, and I think the last line is really just kind of a mic drop moment, right? Because the emperor says, but okay, your point I understand, but there's also people who are pretty, who have Torah learning and wisdom, perhaps a reference to Rabbi Eliezer, who is known to be very beautiful. And Yehoshua says, if those pretty people were ugly, maybe they'd know even more stuff. Which I just think is a lovely and sassy response, right? Which is perhaps that he sees the vessel is not the important part. Right? What the person looks like isn't the important part. The ceramic vessel with the good wine doesn't matter. The wine is what's good.
I like
Sarah?
that he just slips in a lesson about good wine storage as well.
Yeah. Rabbis always know how to store their wine.
I'm trying to think if the handsome people were ugly. So if these silver vessels for wine were ceramic instead of being silver, the wine would be even better.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it does work to some extent.
Is he trying to get in a side swipe at the other rabbi?
He might be. I mean, there's no reference here, but we do know there's many stories talk about how beautiful Rabbi Eliezer was.
But by saying that people would be even more learned if they were less beautiful, if the beauty has made them conceited, and therefore it's restricted their learning, if only a little, that would be the case. The other thing is that beauty shines through, so it's irrelevant. If someone is beautiful but shallow, they're like a painted doll, nothing in them. So the beauty doesn't count anyway.
Yeah. He works an interesting philosophical lesson in there, and especially an unusual one in a society that very much praised physical beauty, right? Certainly Greco-Roman society was quite obsessed with physical beauty. Here he's saying that it's the wisdom that matters, not the beauty. And that actually the beautiful people could do with a bit more wisdom, and maybe it'd be easier for them if they weren't so beautiful. Which is, I mean, something maybe we can take away regardless. Certainly one of the takeaways is we see a window into how he deals with the Romans. I remember Rabbi Eliezer, when the Roman noblewoman asked him a sassy question, said, you know what, forget you, and was rude to her, and as a result lost all the tithes that she was giving to the academy. Rabbi Yehoshua not only responds to the emperor's daughter, who calls him ugly, right, a personal attack, but also uses an opportunity to teach her and to make a kind of statement, a moral lesson about it. So he's not bothered by interacting with the emperor and with his family and with trying to actually kind of see this as an opportunity for teaching. It's not something that he's scared of. And he's also not too proud to be insulted and move on. Well, he's not that bothered. Let's see another lovely one about him and Hadrian, who evidently were friends. Hadrian, may his bones be ground to dust, my favorite curse that you just slip in there after someone's name, by the way, said to Rabbi Yehoshua, I am better than your teacher Moses. He asked, what makes you say so? Hadrian said, because I am alive and he is dead. And isn't it written, a living dog is better than a dead lion? From Ecclesiastes. The Romans are always using our text against us. Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, can you order that no one should kindle a fire in Rome for 3 days? Certainly I can, said Hadrian. And at once he issued a decree that no fire be kindled in Rome for 3 days. But on that very day, toward evening, when Hadrian went up to the roof of his palace, Rabbi Yehoshua joined him there, and the two lifted their eyes and saw smoke rising from a distant corner of the city. Rabbi Yehoshua asked, what's the meaning of that smoke, then? Hadrian replied, a captain is ill. The doctor went to examine him and said that unless the patient is given hot drinks, he won't recover. Rabbi Yehoshua looked again and saw smoke rising from another part of the city, and asked, what's the meaning of that smoke? And Hadrian replied and said, you'll find that a prefect is ill. A doctor went to examine him and said that unless he is warmed by a hot water bottle, he won't recover. Rabbi Yehoshua then said, may the breath of a man like you be blasted out. While you are still alive, your decree is not endured for even 1 day, whereas since the day our teacher Moses decreed for us, you shall kindle no fires in your dwellings on the Shabbat day. Have you ever seen a Jew kindle a fire on Shabbat? And yet you say, I am better than Moses. Again, sassy, a bit risque to be embarrassing the Emperor of Rome. Not clear how literal we should understand these stories to be, although there's enough of them that there must have been some basis for Rabbi Yehoshua being in the court in Rome, in the city of Rome, and dealing with the Roman emperor at some stage in his life. Whether that was Hadrian or another emperor, it's not so clear. But we see a very different image here of how to interact with the people around us. We see a different image of how to treat our students, perhaps, people who ask questions of us. And we see a different image as to taking opportunities to teach original thoughts rather than just repeat what you have heard. So we have two very different personalities in these two primary students of Rabbi Yoḥanan ben Zakkai. When Rabbi Yoḥanan ben Zakkai dies, he jointly appoints both Eliezer and Yehoshua as the leaders of the academy at Yavneh, and thus also of the Jewish people. So both of these men are now responsible for determining the future, and they're so different. We can only assume they didn't get along with each other for a variety of reasons. Although maybe we can imagine they were friends who respected each other, they were very, very different. Their backgrounds, their approach to Torah, their approach to the society around them, how they dealt with conflict, very different leadership styles. And that's really exemplified in a very famous story, which is what I wanted to end with, about the oven of Ḥananiah. Now, the particulars don't matter, and many people will have heard the story before, but the particulars of the oven are irrelevant. But basically, someone named Ḥananiah, or a type of oven known as an Ḥananiah, was brought to the Beit Midrash, and the question was whether or not the oven is kosher. A typical question that would have been asked every day, a mundane question. And it's the question that broke apart the academy. So, let us read. This is known as the oven of Ḥananiah. That's just the introduction. The sages taught, on that day, when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations from him. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree outside the window will prove it. And the carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 500 cubits. So the carob tree got up, walked over, and planted itself somewhere else, proving, of course, that Rabbi Eliezer was right. The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from the carob tree. So Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this stream will prove it. And lo, the water in the stream turned backward and began flowing the opposite direction. Clearly he was right. And they said to him, one doesn't cite halachic proof from a stream. So Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. And the walls of the study hall started to lean inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halacha, what's the nature of your involvement in this dispute, walls? The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they didn't straighten because of the deference due to Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. It's a little footnote about the walls. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? Literally, God came down and said, he's right every time. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven. Quoting Deuteronomy. The Gemara relates, years after, Rabbi Natan, this is generations later, encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration? And Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. Okay, bit of a strange story. Let's just summarize. So the rabbis are debating a quite mundane item, which is an oven. Is it kosher? Is it not kosher? Rabbi Eliezer says it's not kosher. The other rabbis say it is kosher, including Rabbi Yehoshua, who's leading the majority of sages in the academy, who all agree it is kosher. Rabbi Eliezer is the only one who has a different point of view. Rabbi Eliezer, our inflexible, proud individual who we've come to know over the course of the last hour. He decides that he is obviously right, and he's going to prove it. And so he starts basically creating miracles to prove it. First, he says, if I'm right, this tree outside is going to move. And the tree picks up and moves. And the rabbis go, And he said, okay, well, if I'm right, the stream's going to turn backwards. And the stream turns backwards. And he says, well, the rabbis go, we don't care about the stream. He says, okay, well, if I'm right, then the walls of the Beit Midrash will collapse down upon us. And the walls start shaking. And Rabbi Yehoshua tells them off, saying, what business of it is yours if we're having an argument down here? And so the walls end up stuck like this, rather than falling and rather than going back. And eventually Rabbi Eliezer pulls out his trump card, which is to say, if I'm right, then God himself will issue a proclamation to say, I am right and you guys are wrong. And lo and behold, God himself issues a proclamation. A voice appears in the Beit Midrash and says, Rabbi Eliezer is always right. He's never wrong. He's right every time. What are you guys doing arguing with him? And Rabbi Yehoshua, leading the other rabbis, the majority, says, we don't care. The Torah is not in heaven. It's down here with us. And if we decide that this oven is kosher, then it's kosher. No matter what God says, or the stream, or the carob tree, or the walls of the Beit Midrash, or Rabbi Eliezer. He might be technically correct, but it doesn't matter if he's right, because ultimately the majority rules, and we have the decision to make because the Torah is in our hands, not in the hands of heaven. Nothing could be a better description of the debate that's taken place between do we preserve the tradition accurately and meticulously and carefully, or do we innovate and be creative with it and create new and innovative strategies for it? And Rabbi Yehoshua wins the day. What's not mentioned in the story is that after this, Rabbi Eliezer was excommunicated. He was banned from the Beit Midrash. He lived the rest of his life by himself, alone, not talking to anyone, and bitterly angry about this conflict that took place, and never actually taking his proper seat. When he died and everyone went to his funeral, many of the rabbis weren't there, because for many, many years he refused to talk to any of the other rabbis, and isolated himself for the rest of his life by himself, away from everyone else, in anger at the fact that he was right, but nobody listened to him. And the amazing thing is the postscript, to some extent, the postscript of the story, in which many, many generations later, there's a little footnote in which actually one of the rabbis describes meeting Elijah the prophet and asking him, hey, by the way, as we were debating this thing about the oven, what was God doing? And Elijah told him at that moment, God was laughing, chuckling, chortling, and saying, my children have outsmarted me. They've triumphed over me. God evidently was pleased with the fact that the humans didn't listen to the divine voice, didn't care that Eliezer was right, and decided they were going to decide the halakha anyway. With this story, you have a complete victory for Rabbi Yehoshua and his approach to Torah. Rabbi Eliezer is sidelined from here on out. His Torah is never really taught again. His students are many, and many people go and still and teach in his name and repeat things he taught them. But the style of approach to learning is entirely Rabbi Yehoshua's after this. the innovative, creative, interpretive style, the one that's quite at ease talking to the Roman emperor and quite at ease dealing with the problems of the day, and the style of Rabbi Eliezer, the kind of constrained, repetitive, I only say what I learned from my teachers, the plastered well that never loses a drop, is completely pushed to the side. And as halakha develops into the next generation, as we'll see next time when we look at Akiva, who was a student of both these men, it is very much the interpretive, very much the creative original style, the one that generated all these books and all the books you'll find on the walls of a Beit Midrash today, which won the day. And it's because of these two men, these two students of Yochanan ben Zakkai, and the debates they had and how those debates were settled, that Judaism developed the way it did. Because we can imagine a Judaism that followed Rabbi Eliezer instead, one that was just about repeating exactly what we learned and never adding anything new. Actually, you don't have to imagine it, because you can see that in Orthodoxy today, in which Judaism is the Rabbi Eliezer style of, well, we did this last generation, so we're going to do it this generation, and we're going to do it the next generation. We're never going to innovate or change or develop anything new, right? Or as David says, the Karaites, right, who had a similar approach to say, nope, we're going to do exactly what we did before. Actually, there's a reason that Rabbi Yehoshua won the day. And although the Rabbi Eliezer school of thought is still around and still shows up, mostly in my experience in the Haredi world, in which no one ever wants to do anything new, we have to cling to the fact that Rabbi Yehoshua won. He was wrong, technically, but he won. Because it doesn't matter that he was wrong technically. It matters that the majority followed him and that the creativity and originality of his approach was something which is cherished by Rabbinic Judaism as we know it. And that's partially why it's so valuable that we develop Judaism today and continue to do so, because of that fact that the approach of Rabbi Yehoshua is the one that won the day. So although these two men are very far from our own experience and their debates are very different than our own, the framework of this debate between them is still very relevant to our Judaism today. And as we continue to see these early sages, we'll see very many instances in which these debates are repeated all throughout Jewish history. But in many ways, these two are the prototype of the chavruta, the pair who debate and don't always agree and sometimes go their separate ways, but through their arguments and disagreements, actually propel forward the development of Torah. Thank you for joining me. Hopefully an interesting look at two very interesting men. There are much more stories about both of these guys in the tradition, and I encourage you to look up more, and I'm happy to point you to where you can find more. As last time, I'll recommend a book which is very much the inspiration for our learning tonight. The Sages. It's a series of books by Rabbi Binyamin Lau. He's a modern Orthodox rabbi in Israel. It's in English. It's quite easy to read. And each volume and each section deals with a different one of these rabbis. And when you get to know them as individuals, you can appreciate them much more for their time and ours. Next time, we'll take a look at Rabbi Akiva, a very significant founder of Judaism as it continues, and a student of both Eliezer and Yehoshua.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.